Hey guys, Rob Noire here. What we're about to talk about was originally part of a different video that I'm currently working on, but I ended up going so in-depth here that I decided to make this its own thing. Enjoy. Whenever I play games on this channel that are updated versions of games from our past, I've noticed that there tends to be a lot of discourse over whether the game is actually a remaster, a port, or even a full-on remake. Because a lot of people seem to be very unclear on what the differences are, and rightly so as you're about to see, I figured I'd break it down for you here. We're going to start this video off by talking about what's probably the most confusing entry: ports. Now, ports probably seem pretty simple on the surface, but as we dive deeper and deeper into the layers here, you can easily see where it can get a little bit confusing. Now, when a game is being developed, it's usually made on one main platform. Now, when the game is finished, the developer might decide that they want to bring it to other platforms such as Xbox, PlayStation, or Nintendo. They now need to make a version of this same game that will run on these other platforms. This is what we refer to as a port. Now, these ports can be developed at the same time as the original version of the game alongside it, or they can also be developed and released much later. Now, a good way to break this down is to imagine an artist making a painting. After they finish the painting, they hang it up in a specific room in their house. Now, later on, they decide to release prints of this painting, and they hang these prints in different rooms. Now, the painting and the prints are the game itself, and the different rooms are the different platforms. Now, this isn't to say that all ports are exactly the same. It's a very common practice for there to be content that's exclusive to one platform or another. Now, this can be different skins and cosmetics, it can be different characters, it can even be DLC. A good example of this is The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, which was originally released for PC and Xbox 360. It was then later released on PlayStation 3. Now, the original PC and Xbox versions got a huge amount of downloadable content, ranging from huge new areas with quest lines to explore, dungeons with enhanced loot, new homes and bases, and even some truly useless stuff like the infamous horse armor. However, the PlayStation 3 version of The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, despite coming out a year later, didn't get the vast majority of this downloadable content. The PlayStation 3 version also took advantage of the PS3 hardware and was praised for being graphically nicer than the Xbox version at the time. So that brings up another issue when it comes to ports: differences between versions. This is where there can start to be some overlap with HD remasters. So taking advantage of slightly more powerful hardware or optimizing your game slightly better on a different platform is not really a big deal. However, there were a lot of games released when consoles were transitioning between standard definition and high definition. So essentially, you could have one version of the game running on, let's say, the Xbox 360, and it's in 720p HD, and it is the full version of the game. But then you might have a much lesser version of the game running in standard definition on another console, let's say the Wii. Sometimes these ports had to be significantly downgraded in multiple aspects just to be able to get them to run on the much less powerful hardware. A good example of this is the game Dead Rising, where the game had to be changed so much that it got the subtitle "Chop Till You Drop." The spawn limit of zombies is significantly reduced, you're now on a set path and you can't free roam, and even some of the more intense scenes are now just QuickTime event cutscenes. Another example is Sonic Unleashed, where the overworld where you can actually interact with characters in the Xbox version. In the Wii version, it's just static images of the characters with dialogue boxes. Now, these versions are still technically ports, but they fall into that kind of gray area. Typically, they're what we call downgraded ports. They're called downgraded because things had to be cut and left out in order to make them actually run on much less powerful hardware. Downgraded ports usually refers to the content within the game and not just specifically the resolution. So games like Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, which do have ports for the Switch, which run in a much lower resolution, are still just considered regular ports and not really downgraded. Making things even more confusing is it also works the other way. Some games came out in standard definition first and then came out on an HD console, so this is called an HD port. This does differ from an HD remaster, and we'll get into kind of like the nitty-gritty of that in the next section, but an HD port doesn't have any improved assets over the original. It's just running in a better resolution with the same textures and models that are on the standard definition version. Most of the definitive, Game of the Year, or deluxe version of games are also just ports or even just re-releases. Now, the waters can get even more muddied here when companies like Nintendo will release deluxe versions of games which have additional content. These are still technically ports as well, despite sharing a bunch of different attributes with other things we're about to talk about. Like I said, ports can be really damn confusing. They're probably the most confusing thing we're going to talk about on this list. Here's a quick checklist of the basic things that make a port. Number 2, HD remasters. Okay, so this one should be a little bit easier to understand, in theory anyways. So what do you do if you're a developer that made a great game that sold really well and was very well received back in the day, but you're not able to play it on the modern generation of consoles? Fans are asking for it and there's a lot of money to be made, but porting over the original game probably won't go over that well because it's pretty outdated in terms of visuals and controls. That's where the HD remaster comes in. Now, the biggest and most notable upgrade that most HD remasters will have is that they now play in 16:9 widescreen in either 720p, 1080p, or even 4K. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but typically they are upgraded in this way. Now, remasters are not something that's specific to the HD era of gaming, but they became more and more popular during the age of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. And honestly, one of the things that can really make you see the difference when it comes to a remaster is that bump between standard def and a high def. However, making a 4:3 game into 16:9 and calling it a day isn't usually enough. These games also typically have updated and higher resolution textures, assets, character models, and these little touches can really help the game shine. It's also not uncommon for developers to tweak the gameplay a little here and there to make it more in line with other games in the series or bring it up to modern standards. A good example of this is actually the first Kingdom Hearts game, which has been remastered 6 ways to Sunday at this point. In the original game, a lot of your useful functions were actually mapped to this HUD menu. It includes talking to NPCs, opening chests, and just generally interacting with the environment. And you would actually have to move down on the D-pad to this option in the menu and then select it. And while this was selected, you weren't able to, say, attack the Heartless, which were trying to kill you at the time. It was a mechanic that was a little clunky and outdated, even though you definitely get used to it. In Kingdom Hearts 2, they completely changed all of these functions to be mapped to the triangle button. When it came time to remaster the original Kingdom Hearts, they kept this updated control scheme, allowing for much smoother gameplay. Little changes like this are very common in remasters. Sometimes, though, developers will make changes that are even bigger. For example, in The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, there was a huge section near the end of the game involving getting the different Triforce parts. It was basically a long, grindy fetch quest, it involved a ton of backtracking, and it was really just padding out the end of the game for no real reason. The developer of the game actually apologized for this section. When the HD remaster came out, they shortened this section down significantly and fixed it up into something a lot more reasonable. Now, a good HD remaster will also take advantage of the more powerful hardware to provide a much smoother and optimized experience. A good example is a game like Shadow of the Colossus, where the original on PlayStation 2 had a lot of frame rate issues. PlayStation 3 version has pretty much gotten rid of these issues and is much more fluid. HD remasters will also often have new and special items that are often very powerful. If there's any kind of additional content, like maybe a port had some specific content to that port, it's usually included, making the HD remaster the definitive version of the game that released at that time. Sometimes it will also include new content, stuff that was either made for the remaster, and even sometimes stuff that had been designed for the original game but had never been finished. However, there can also be content that is cut. For example, it's not uncommon for licensed music to be changed or swapped out. This is usually because the license has expired and it's not worth getting a new license. Also, if there was anything that was pre-rendered in the original game, such as cutscenes, often the developer will not extend the remastering to these cutscenes. At best, they will just be upscaled to 1080p, they'll still run in 4:3, and typically they'll look pretty bad. So in this example, it would be like the artist of that original painting going back and touching it up many years later, making it look as good as they can without fundamentally changing it. So the short list for this one is now let's move on to HD remakes. This one can get pretty complicated and it's often confused with remasters more than anything else. A remake is basically a new artist making a new painting from scratch and using that original painting as reference. While it may be based on that original painting, they can make the new one as close to it as they want or as completely different as they want. An HD remake is a reimagining of a game built from the ground up. Typically all of the character models, environments, assets, and not to mention the game engine are all completely different and usually created from scratch. And because this process is making a game from the ground up, you can do pretty much whatever you want with it. There tend to be 3 distinct types of remakes. And again, these are not specific to the era of HD, but mainly what we're going to be talking about here are HD remakes. First type is faithful to the original. So the developers tried to make the game as close to the original game as physically possible, even to the point of it conflicting with their ability to bring the game up to modern standards. A good example of this is again the game Shadow of the Colossus, which didn't just get an HD remaster, it also got a full-on HD remake. The remake is extremely extremely close to the original. While in terms of graphics, everything is significantly more detailed than the original, visually and thematically, it's very close to what they were going for when they first made the game. They even kept some of the more outdated aspects, such as pretty awkward controls, as opposed to updating it to a modern control scheme. Now, the benefit of doing this is that you're giving the fans exactly what they think they want. And while there might be some quibbles over minor details and things that have been slightly changed here and there, it's basically the same game that you're offering. Now, the problem with this approach is that by giving the exact same game, there's not necessarily much of an advantage over the older game itself. And there's a lot of people who probably have nostalgia for that older game and will prefer it. Now, the second type is the updated original. Now, an update to the original will obviously contain a lot of the same elements like enhanced visuals, etc., but also it will include a slew of modern tweaks and updates to the gameplay, the UI, and everything else to try and make it a smoother and more modern experience. Typically, quality of life is the goal here, while story elements and the like remain pretty close to the original. Now, this approach is more or less trying for the best of both worlds, giving the players the old game that they love, but with modern tweaks trying to bring it up to par with current gen titles. Now, again, this is the kind of thing where a lot of people might disagree with the changes made, but when this is done properly, it can really enhance an older game. I would say that the vast majority of HD remakes tend to fall somewhere in this category here. Adding a bunch of little tweaks, quality of life updates, and even some new content really allows the players to experience something new alongside something familiar. Now, the third type of HD remake is the complete overhaul. While this is not that common, it basically involves the developer taking the original story, concept, and characters of the game and doing something completely new with it. The most recent example that I can think of this would be the Final Fantasy VII Remake. The remake turned the original game on its head with a totally different and expanded story, completely different gameplay mechanics, and a visual look that was miles ahead of the original. Now, this is the riskiest type of remake to do, because instead of giving the fans what they want and what they expect, you're giving them a totally new product. These kind of HD remakes almost fall more into the category of being like a sequel, and depending on the player's response, these can fall really hard or succeed wildly. Giving players something new will definitely surprise them, but if in the end all they wanted was the same thing just with a fresh coat of paint, it won't be to their liking. So the shortlist for HD remakes is And finally, let's get onto a bonus item on the list, the spiritual successor. A spiritual successor is basically an unofficial sequel to a game, but it's in the style of a Hollywood film and where the names, places, and identities have been changed to protect the identity of the individuals involved. These are often spearheaded by developers who worked on the original games, and they're an attempt to bring back something that has been missing for a long time and do it justice. Now, spiritual successors can be extremely close to what they're based on or really far off. The basic intent here is to capture the overall feel and style of the original game without getting it so close that you'll be sued for copyright. A good example of a game that's extremely close to what it's based on is the game Yooka-Laylee, a spiritual successor to the much beloved Banjo and Kazooie series. The team behind this game was made up of a lot of the people who worked on the Banjo series back in the day. This game, you play a duo of animal characters, but instead of being a bear and a bird, you're a chameleon and a bat. Instead of running around collecting notes to open doors, you're collecting quills. Instead of using jigsaw pieces to complete pictures that open worlds, it's pages to complete books that open world. All the same building blocks of Banjo-Kazooie are here. 3D platforming, a large and varied moveset, collectibles, characters with funny voices and funny personalities, and there's even music crafted by the same composers. And now, spiritual successors don't necessarily have to be as close of a copy as Yooka was to Banjo. Sometimes just having the same gameplay mechanics or even just the same themes present is enough to call a game a spiritual successor. Because they always involve completely new characters and locations, they aren't usually mistaken for the original. So a quick checklist here. So that's the video. I hope you found it helpful. As you can see, there's a lot of crossover between these different things that we talked about. That's why it can be so confusing as to see what is actually just a port, an HD remaster, or actually a full-blown HD remake. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about here can be boiled down to semantics, but hopefully I've helped make it a little bit more clear what the differences are. I actually think it's pretty great that we live in a world where an amazing game can literally get ported, then an HD remaster, and then an HD remake, and maybe even a spiritual successor, so that literally everybody who wants to can enjoy this game. All right, guys, well, thanks a lot for watching. If you have any questions or you disagree with any of the points I've made here, feel free to leave it down in the comments below. And as always, I will see you in another video. Take care, everyone.